Kosovo is Serbia. 3 words, no argument, no evidence, and no history. Just 3 words typed into a comment box by someone who has never opened a history book in their life, but has apparently memorized every piece of nationalist propaganda that their government has ever fed them. I've been getting these comments for a while now. I get them on my Instagram. I get them on my TikTok. They even show up in my DMs. And every single time, it's the same damn script. It's the same talking points, and it's the same debunked claims recycled like they're fucking gospel. So today, we're going to settle this. Not with emotion, not with nationalism, but with documented history, genetic science, and the actual text of the legal documents these people keep citing without having read them at all. My name is Valdette. My parents are born in Kosovo, and I'm Albanian. And this is Radical Leftist Scum. Welcome. If you go to any Albanian-related content on Instagram or TikTok, you will undoubtedly find a slew of the same comments I opened up with. Kosovo, Serbia, Kosovo, Serbia. Like I said, it happens to me all the time. Especially happens when I talk about current events like the Prime Minister of Albania, Edi Rama, and what he's doing to Albania, or if anytime I mention Kosovo. But I also always see it on other Albanian content creators' posts as well. And these comments always come from Serbians, obviously. So let me just be frank. The problem is that Serbian nationalism teaches a version of Balkan history that just doesn't exist. And I know this for 2 reasons. I have empirical data and I have anecdotal data. The literature on this topic is just not aligned with Serbian nationalist history. And I have a friend who came from Serbia, and he's a good friend of mine, and he told me, and I quote, "You wouldn't believe the things they told us about you." The real challenge here is the confusion between ancestral origin, or earliest known population continuity, and political control of a territory at one point in history. One of these things is not like the other, friend. Ruling land for a period of time is not the same thing as being the first people of that land. The purpose of this episode is to shed some light on truth by debunking some of the myths being served as quote-unquote history. So we're going to explore the history of Kosovo, Albanians, and Serbians. We'll look into what recent genetic studies have uncovered, and we're going to get into the legal arguments too, because people keep throwing around things like, and this is especially United Nations Resolution 1244, or the UN Charter, and international law, like they've actually read any of it. Spoiler alert, friend, they haven't. Now, I also want to be clear about something. There is a wealth of credible data and information out there, and I highly encourage you to research this topic on your own. I'll have all my references listed on my blog, so I have a blog post about this very topic too, so if you're a visual learner or you want to read about it, I have some graphics. I'll have all my resources on my website, valdesalimai.com, which I'll link in the episode. You can check it out there. There's a ton of great resources you can use to learn about this topic. My intent here is not to give you a documentary. My intent here is to give you just a broad overview, like the main points, the most relevant data, so we can start debunking some of these myths and create more clarity. And for some of you, some of you listening, you might not like the clarity, but I always say clarity is kindness. So this is my way of being kind. So let's get into it. So before we talk about present day, we have to start at the beginning to understand how we got here to today. So let's just start with the history. So again, there's a visual on my website. So the blog post is already up, so you can check it out there. But timeline-wise, Paleo-Balkan people settled in the Balkans during the Bronze Age. So we're talking roughly maybe 3000 BCE, 2000 BCE. From there, the Illyrian Iron Age and kingdoms were born and flourished. So this is about like 1000 BCE. So Illyrian culture and language were established at that point. Now, unfortunately, much of that culture and the language wasn't heavily documented. Illyrians didn't leave us with a whole lot of written record the way like the Romans did. But they did have their own societies. They had their own trade routes. They interacted with different peoples of the land. Greeks actually began describing Illyrians around 350 BCE, before Common Era. Now, here's the thing about Illyrians. Illyrians were made up of various tribes. Many of them had their own territories. One group I want to specifically focus on are the Dardanians. The Dardanians had their own kingdom, Dardania, on the land that would eventually become Kosovo. In the 1st century BCE, Rome invaded Illyria through a series of battles, through a series of wars that they ended up winning. Illyria lost, and they were controlled by Rome and became Illyricum. The Illyrians became Romanized. So Illyrians at the time were pagan, but they were converted to Christianity through the Romans, but they still managed to retain significant elements of their language and culture. And when you look at the Illyrian timeline, we're talking about roughly 1,500 years of continuous presence on that land. One of the Illyrian tribes who inhabited what would become modern-day Albania were known as the Albanoi. The root word from Albanoi is where the modern name Albania and Albanian come from. Okay, so there's a little bit about the Illyrians. Now let's talk about the Serbs, more specifically the South Slavic tribes. It wasn't until the 6th and 7th centuries, CE, Common Era, that South Slavic tribes started migrating into the Balkans. And now this part's crucial. This part's important. The South Slavic tribes first encountered and began mixing with Illyrian populations around 550 to 610 CE. Let that sink in. If Illyrians rose up around 1000 BCE and they first interacted with the South Slavic tribes in about 550 CE, for 1,500 years, Illyrians were on that land long before they interacted with Slavs. Serbians, who are the descendants of the Slavs, began expanding their reach in the Balkans. And during the medieval period, roughly around 1166 to 1371, the Nemanjic, I don't speak Serbian, so I hope I said that right, dynasty incorporated Dardania, the land that would eventually become Kosovo, into their domain. And it became the political, economic, and spiritual heartland of medieval Serbia. They built churches and monasteries on that land because they made it very spiritual. I want to acknowledge that clearly, because it's true and it matters, Serbian medieval presence in Kosovo was real and quite substantial. But here's the thing, and this is where the mythology starts to distort the history. That presence peaked before 1389, not because of 1389. The Battle of Kosovo in 1389 was not when Serbia took control of Kosovo. It was when Serbia lost control. The Serbian-led coalition at the time was defeated by the Ottomans. Both Prince Lazar and Sultan Murad I died on that battlefield. The battle became central to Serbian national mythology, and they preserved it through epic poetry and the Orthodox Church across centuries of Ottoman rule. But it was a catastrophic defeat. It was not a moment of assertion. And this is also partly why Serbians consider Kosovo as like sacred land because of this war. Okay, so now from 1459 to around 1878, 4 centuries, the Ottomans ruled the Balkans, including Kosovo. Most ethnic Albanians converted to Islam, largely to access the benefits of the Ottoman Empire that they offered Muslims. So there was lower taxes versus non-Muslims. They had more social mobility and opportunities within the empire. Kosovo's demographics shifted during the 17th and 18th centuries as many Serbs migrated north towards the Habsburg Empire to avoid conflicts and the pressure to convert because they wanted to stay Orthodox. And so they left. Now, it's a part of history that we don't talk enough about. And honestly, I just learned about it myself while I was researching this episode the past few weeks. Minus, I did have cyclospora, so I had to take a break. But what we don't talk enough about is the Treaty of Berlin. On July 13th, 1878, the Treaty of Berlin was signed. This had an enormous impact on both Serbians and Albanians. Serbia was officially recognized as an independent state, which is a very genuinely significant thing. But before the treaty was signed, something terrible happened. The expulsion of Albanians from 1877 to 1878. During this time, this was the forced migration and ethnic cleansing of between 49,000 to about 130,000 mostly Muslim Albanians by Serbian and Montenegrin armies. These Albanians were expelled from Sanjak of Nis and the Toplica region, which again, those are Serbian. I don't know if I said those right, but those would become southern Serbia. And those Muslim Albanians that were expelled and forced to migrate, they settled in Kosovo and Macedonia. This is documented. It's not disputed by any serious historians. In fact, even some Serbian officials at the time objected to it. A Serbian general offered his resignation in protest, and a Belgrade law professor later wrote that the expulsion was a strategic catastrophe, that Serbia had created permanent enemies across the border who now had every reason to resist Serbian expansion. No shit. The Serbian regime, and I'm quoting the historical record here, encouraged about 71,000 Muslims, including 49,000 Albanians, to leave, then gradually settled Serbs and Montenegrins in those territories. So let me just say this part real plainly. Serbians ethnically cleansed Albanians and displaced them into Kosovo in 1777 and 1878. And then they turned around and complained that Kosovo was heavily populated by Albanians, and they ethnically cleansed and displaced Kosovar Albanians in the 90s. So somebody fucking make that make sense. This is also the critical missing context in the Serbian nationalist framing of Kosovo demographics. The Albanian demographic growth in Kosovo wasn't just organic population movement. It was directly caused by Serbian state policy, pushing Albanians out of newly acquired Serbian territory and into Kosovo. The demographic shift that gets pointed to as evidence of Albanian quote-unquote late arrival in Kosovo was substantially their own government's doing. You know, it's bad enough that people like to throw around Kosovo, Serbia in my comments or they message me. But this is also the part where people like to throw around words like international law and the United Nations as though citing authority is the same thing as actually making an argument. Someone who had a Serbian username inboxed me on TikTok and told me that the Resolution 1244, quote unquote, clearly states Kosovo is part of Serbia. And someone else told me it's international law and the United Nations are saying that. And then they doubled down by citing the UN Charter, Resolution 1244, UN membership, UN Security Council membership, and international law as a whole, and the Constitution of Serbia. That's a lot of sources, so let's go through every single one. Okay, first, let's start with the UN Charter. The UN Charter establishes principles like sovereignty and territorial integrity. That's true. But it also enshrines the right of self-determination of peoples. And often these two principles are in genuine tension with each other, and the Charter does not resolve that tension in favor of either side, Serbia or Kosovo, automatically. So citing the UN Charter as though it clearly settles Kosovo's status is an oversimplification. International legal scholars have debated exactly this tension for decades. The Charter does not hand Serbia Kosovo. It doesn't hand Kosovo independence either. It just creates a framework within which these questions have to be resolved, and that the resolution has to account for both sovereignty and self-determination. And then the most common one that I see everyone always responds with United Nations Resolution 1244. I'm going to be real with y'all. I don't think anyone's actually read this fucking thing. At no point does it state that Kosovo is part of Serbia. Serbian nationalists point to the preamble language that reaffirms the quote-unquote the commitment of all member states to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. That's the line they quote. But two things need to be understood about that. First, the language is in the preamble. In international law, preamble language is considered interpretive text. It is not binding. It is not a binding legal command. The operative clauses, the numbered paragraphs that actually create legal obligations, they tell a completely different story. Second, those operative clauses directly contradict the idea that Kosovo's status was settled. The resolution establishes UNMIK as an interim administration, so UNMIK, as an interim administration, an explicitly temporary governing structure, and tasks it with, and I'm quoting directly from 1244, quote unquote, facilitating a political process designed to determine Kosovo's future status. You do not mandate a process to determine a status that is already clearly settled. The entire framework is interim and transitional, a placeholder pending a final political resolution, not a declaration that Serbia owns Kosovo. In fact, people don't realize this because no one reads the fucking thing. Resolution 1244 is exactly what cleared the political path for Kosovo's independence in 2008. It called for, in its own words, you can read it and look at it yourself, quote unquote, substantial autonomy and a meaningful self-administration for Kosovo. That is what the Antisari Plan process led to. This is what Kosovo's Declaration of Independence was the outcome of. And then the other one is UN membership. Anybody who brings up the UN or UN membership, this actually cuts against the Serbian argument. And here's why. Kosovo is not a member of the UN. Like, that's true. We know that. But do you know why? Because Serbia has blocked it. And it was backed by Russia and China on the Security Council. So that's not a legal determination that Kosovo is a part of Serbia. That's Security Council deadlock, a political fact driven by geopolitical alliances, not an adjudication of sovereignty. Meanwhile, don't forget this, 117 countries have recognized Kosovo's independence, including the United States and most of the European Union. UN non-membership doesn't mean Kosovo is Serbia. It means that the Security Council is paralyzed, which is a very different thing. All right, up next, because this one comes up too. UN Security Council membership. Let's be clear. Serbia holds no special Security Council status relevant to Kosovo. None. This claim, and when people bring this up, this UN Security Council membership, it's so vague, it's almost meaningless. Like, I don't even know what work it's supposed to be doing in the argument. Like, Serbia is not a permanent member of the Security Council, so it has no veto. So, like, moving on. Now let's talk about international law as a whole. Here's what's interesting about invoking, quote unquote, international law as a whole, because I've seen people do this too. It's international law. The most authoritative international legal ruling, specifically on Kosovo's Declaration of Independence, goes against this argument. In 2010, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, issued an advisory opinion on Kosovo, and they found that Kosovo's Declaration of Independence did not violate international law. That is the most direct international legal ruling on this specific question, and it cuts in Kosovo's favor. International law as a whole does not clearly support the Serbian claim. The most specific and authoritative ruling on the precise question at issue says the opposite. And there's the last one. This comes up sometimes too. The Constitution of Serbia. This is the only claim on the list that I just gave you, on the entire list that I just gave you, that's technically accurate. Serbia's constitution does define Kosovo as part of Serbia. But here's the thing. A country's domestic constitution has no binding force on another territory's status under international law. A country can write whatever it wants in its own constitution. That does not make it legally operative beyond its own borders. An example that comes to mind for me is it's like if the United States changed our constitution to say that Greenland was a territory, cool, but that doesn't mean shit to Greenland. They don't have to abide by anything because that doesn't go past our borders. So it can't be illegally enforced. So we could put whatever we want in our constitution, but it doesn't make it so. And the same goes for Serbia. You put it in your constitution, but it doesn't make it so. I mean, again, using that logic, right? Like North Korea's constitution defines South Korea as part of North Korea. So does that just settle it? No, of course not. Domestic constitutional claims and recognized international sovereignty are entirely different legal categories. The argument provides nothing except that Serbia wants Kosovo, which nobody disputes. So up until recently, the debate around whether Albanians descend from Illyrians was purely historical and linguistic. But science has now weighed in, and it basically has put this argument to rest, finally. A major genetic study was published in a peer-reviewed journal in Nature Human Behavior on May 4th, 2026. Researchers traced Albanian DNA and our origins to early medieval inhabitants of the Western Balkans. And what they found was that Albanians descend from a small ancestral population that lived in modern-day Albania around 800 to 900 CE, centuries before Albanians appeared in written records, and are genetically linked to many present-day Albanians. Now, here's what the research also found. The research traced Albanian ancestry to the Bronze and Iron Age Western Balkan populations, so historically associated with the Illyrians. Early medieval Albanians preserved roughly 60 to 84% of that ancient ancestry. So that's genetic continuity. That happened even as surrounding populations absorbed massive genetic contributions from Eastern Europe and Anatolian migrants during the migration period. So like for reference, neighboring populations in Croatia, Montenegro, and Serbia absorbed between 40 and 86% of Eastern Europe or Eastern European ancestry during that era. Albanian ancestors, by contrast, absorbed considerably less, averaging only about 10 to 20%. So what this means, if we put it in layman's terms, is that Albanians have genetic continuity with Illyrians. The Slavic migrations transformed the Balkans. No one's going to argue that. But Albanians managed to preserve our DNA, our language, and our culture despite that. And I was reading up on this and I was watching some videos on it. And it's thought the way we actually did that was because we lived in the mountains. And so that kept us pretty separate and siloed from everything else that was going on with the transformation of the Slavic tribes coming in. That we kind of stayed isolated. And so we managed to maintain our genetic continuity without inbreeding. So when the researchers did the research, they found that there was no signs of inbreeding. So that's important to know. But that confirms, that kind of tells that we kind of found our space and we stayed in it. Which also, I did my DNA. And if you look at the map of my DNA for like hundreds and even thousands of years, it's actually pretty much in the same place, in the same area of like Kosovo and Albania. So we just found a spot and we found a place and we kind of ducked out and we did our own thing. And I saw this thing on another video that I watched that said, we have so much genetic continuity with our ancestors that if you're Albanian and you look at yourself in the mirror, you're likely looking back at your ancestors. Like they looked like us. You can see the face of your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. That was really powerful for me. So that's just something I've really been thinking about because that's how much genetic continuity we have with our ancestors. Now let's talk about the Albanian language a little bit more. So the Albanian language it stands alone in the Indo-European language tree. There is no language like it. It's definitely not Slavic. There are Albanian words that are strikingly similar to some of the known Illyrian words. And again, if you go to my blog, I actually have an image of like some of the Illyrian words and some of the Albanian words, like Dili, like sun. It's similar in Illyrian and as well as in Albanian. So there's just words that it just logically makes sense that the Albanian language came from the Illyrian language because they are actually quite similar from what we have found. And given the timeline, given the location, and given the newfound genetic continuity, this makes sense out of any other competing hypothesis. Now there are, there's some people, again, some of these people come into my comments and they say the weirdest thing, like, um, we are Azerbaijanian or Azerbaijan, or I forget how to say it. Um, but like, and our language comes from that. And I was like, our language sounds nothing like any other language. Technically, genetic continuity can't confirm linguistic continuity on its own. But again, paired with linguistic evidence, I feel like the picture is just really consistent and it's very compelling. Let's also talk a little bit about the culture. There are figures, Illyrian figures like Queen Tayuta. She was an Illyrian queen who reigned approximately from like 231 to 228 BCE. Tayuta is an Albanian name. And she's not the only Illyrian with a traditional Albanian name. There was another leader named Agroni. So Agron, that's an Albanian name. I don't hear that in other cultures. So we have names, we have language, culture, what we wear, our traditional Albanian clothing. From what I know, from what I've seen, looks like, from what has been pulled up, Illyrian clothing. Their clothing and their helmets. So the cultural thread just runs deep, and it goes beyond genetics and linguistics alone. This whole topic is actually really personal for me. Like, I get very heated about this conversation about Kosovo and Serbia because I'm Albanian. Like, this isn't just an academic topic for me. Like, one look at my name, you can tell that I'm Albanian. My parents were born in Kosovo. They came to the United States. They had us kids here. Albanian was actually my first language. I had to learn English through ESL in school. But it's like more than that. Like, my DNA is Albanian. Every part of me, down to the molecular level, is Albanian. And also, like, my family, my name, my self-perception, my self-concept, how I experience the world, how I navigate the world, that's tied to my ethnicity, to being Albanian. My community, even how I look, like some of my features. I always say I look white, but like everybody else is like, no, you look Albanian. But all these things have shaped me. I'm shaped by my nationality, and they have shaped me. But also, when you think about like the Kosovo War, that's something that like indirectly impacted me, my family, a lot. Some of my core memories as a kid were with my dad, Çerim Selimay. And he would take us out of school. This is the 90s. He would take us out of school and get on a bus to Washington, D.C. My father was passionate about being Albanian. He has so much Albanian literature and tapes, and he's the one who turned us on to Gizemnika. But he was also an activist. And I think I get that from my dad. He was such an activist for the community. And so we would go to DC with thousands of other Albanians, and we would protest outside the White House. And we were calling on the United States to stop the ethnic cleansing of Kosovo Albanians by Serbians. But it wasn't just the protests. It was when I went to Kosovo for the first time in 2003, part of me was so happy to be in the country where my parents were born. I got to see the cities they grew up in, like Klina, Peja. I visited Prizren. I went to Pristina. But it was also a hard trip because in 2003, the country was still war-torn. So many homes were destroyed. I asked my cousins at one point to help me build a family tree, but they said a lot of the documents in the city halls had been destroyed. So there's not a lot of paperwork. But it was the stories that got to me. Like my hala, my aunt. I just met her. It was my first time actually meeting her and her kids. And they told me what happened to them. When Serbian forces came to their house, my cousins hid my aunt, my hala, outside. They had this field outside of the house. And they hid her. And then the Serbians, they rounded up the boys, my four cousins, and they put them in this caravan to take them to be executed. And they managed to jump out and escape with their lives. That's the only reason I know about it. But what they also did was they actually made a short film that went to the Sundance Film Festival called Cowboys in Kosovo, where they shared that experience. So for me, when I think about things like this, it's important to keep advocating for Albanians across the diaspora, for keeping Kosovo independent and defending Kosovo. And it's not Serbia's, it's just not. And, between that and like the corruption in Albania, like these things have to be addressed loudly and with intention. And that's why I use my platform, because this is at my core who I am. Okay, now let's talk about the Serbian nationalist quote unquote history. Look, I don't know what they teach in Serbia, but it certainly isn't history. I get messages, comments, DMs from people who have been clearly fed a version of events that have been completely fabricated or even grotesquely distorted. The Azerbaijan argument, that's one. The Caucasian Albania theory, that claiming modern Albanians were expelled by Azerbaijanis or Armenians in the 10th century. Or the 1244 clearly states Kosovo-Serbia line. For the life of me, I have no idea where they keep coming up with this shit. Like they're literally just repeating back the disinformation they've been told. The Caucasian Albania theory, which someone actually sent me, by the way, claims that modern Albanians are descended from a Caucasian population expelled from Azerbaijan or Armenia. Now, here's the problem with that. Caucasian Albania was an entirely different people in an entirely different region. Modern Azerbaijan, who spoke a Northeast Caucasian language, completely unrelated to the Albania language, which is Indo-European. So the only connection between Caucasian Albania and Balkan Albania is a Latin naming coincidence. That's it. Now, the genetic study I mentioned earlier makes this even clearer. Albanian ancestry traces directly to Bronze and Iron Age Western Balkan populations. There is no Caucasian genetic signal. The theory just isn't historically wrong. It is genetically refuted. And the whole 10th century expulsion framing doesn't even match what actually happened to Caucasian Albanians, whose language was still attested by Arab geographers in the 10th century. They weren't expelled. They were gradually absorbed over centuries through Islamization and Turkization. And the Azerbaijanis expelled them version is also anachronistic. Azerbaijani identity, as we understand it now, didn't even exist until after Oghuz and Turkic tribes entered the Caucasus in the 11th century. So the chronology doesn't work even in its own terms. This is what propaganda does. It produces people who argue with confidence about things that are historically and scientifically impossible. So, Kosovo, Serbia. That was the crux of this entire episode. When we look at both the documented history of Albanians and Serbians and pair that with genetic science, here's what we actually know. Illyrians were on the land that is now Kosovo for over a millennium before Slavic migration began. Slavs and Serbs migrated to the Balkans in the 6th and 7th centuries CE, 1,500 years after Illyrian culture was already established. Serbians expelled Muslim Albanians into Kosovo through a large expulsion and with also with ethnic cleansing between 1877 and 1878. And Albanians are genetically descended from Illyrian area populations with extraordinary continuity that survived the migration period. The Dardani were an ancient Balkan people whose territory included much of modern Kosovo. They existed as an organized political community by the 4th century BCE. They had rulers, armies, they had trade networks, and they had settlements. This is Kosovo's deepest historical layer. Now, we can't deny that Serbia had political control over Kosovo for a period of time. We can't. This is a part of Kosovo's history, and it shouldn't be ignored or erased. Medieval Serbian presence there was very real. The churches and the monasteries are real. Kosovo was a spiritual heartland of medieval Serbia. History is layered and complicated, and I'm not interested in doing to Serbian history what Serbian nationalists do to Albanian history. But ruling land for a period of time is not the same thing as being the first people of that land. Having monuments or buildings somewhere is not always proof of native claim. Look at the United States. We built a ton of shit on this land. It wasn't ours to begin with. There were indigenous people already here. Resolution 1244 did not state that Kosovo is Serbia or belongs to Serbia. It ended the Kosovo War, it stopped ethnic cleansing of Kosovo Albanians, and it actually set into motion Kosovo's path to self-autonomy and sovereignty. The ICJ confirmed in 2010 that Kosovo's Declaration of Independence did not violate international law. And here's the question I keep coming back to in my head. If Albania somehow took Serbia as a territory, would Serbians say Serbia is Albania? No, of course they wouldn't. So the answer, backed by history, genetics, linguistics, and international law, is that Kosovo is not and has not ever been Serbia. Friend, thanks for listening. Links to all the sources are in my blog. Check it out. Do your own research. Keep reading up on it. Stay curious, stay critical, and always, and as always, stay radical.